introducing Genevieve Mitchell, who's going to be our first speaker. Genevieve's commitment to advocacy for peace and justice issues is long-standing. She's a past president and member of the Carl B. Stokes Brigade, which is an organization which dedicates itself to continuing the work and legacy of the nation's first Black major city mayor. She's also president of the Black Women's Center, a community-based nonprofit which honors leadership and vision of dynamic Black women, both historical and living. Ms. Mitchell also serves as editor and journalist for the print communications arm of the Black Board. A gifted writer and communicator, Genevieve has served as a supervisor of Public Information Department at the Cuyahoga County Reporter's Office, a writer and reporter for the Cleveland-based Crusade Urban News, and she's also the former vice president of Cleveland Board of Education and served in the last publicly elected board for the municipal school district. So, Genevieve.
First of all, let me begin by thanking Total Congregation for the use of your wonderful house as a sanctuary for great sermons, music, art, and refinement, but mostly for the building the beloved community by welcoming others through your doors. I'd also like to thank Jeff Kassouf and crew from Take One for doing what they do, keeping an historical record, a visual record of what's going on. To Peace Action for still being on the job, still being on the case after all these many years. And to our esteemed guest, whom I haven't met directly, congregants, community neighbors, and friends. Welcome. Adolf Hitler, Stryker, Frick, Stroop, Hess, Göring, Speer, Jodl, von Papen, Fink, Kaltenbrunner, Himmler, Haas, Mengele, and so many others, deliberately engaged in a systematic process of murder, mass extermination, enslavement, extrajudicial persecution on political, racial, religious, and economic grounds, characterized as crimes against humanity in the World Court of Nuremberg after Allied forces suppressed and neutralized them. History is a cautionary tale, a harbinger of prophetic wisdom, a blueprint that can be used to avoid or follow fate. The plight of the Palestinian nation state reflects many of these same characteristics of the Holocaust with the Nakba and that great possible impending global conflagration in the Middle East, which is often always ripe for war. And let's be clear, an indictment on the actions of certain factions of Jewish leadership is not an indictment against all Jewish people. Jews are not a monolith any more than black people, whites, Arabs, or anybody else. I do not speak for the Jews. I don't hate anybody. And I'm not an expert. I'm a learner and I'm an observer. Instituted through the Enabling Act. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But we must cull information that is useful from this history. In the Nazi state and German society, Robert G. Moeller writes on the rise and demise of Hitler's Third Reich with its staggering death tolls, geopolitical divisions, ascent of the Nazi Party as it came to power in Germany between 1933 and 1945, and the implications of a totalitarian dictatorship that ultimately transformed and controlled every aspect of German life. The swastika becoming an emblematic symbol of terrorism, inflicted by a political regime fronting and on the backdrop against the national anthem, Das Lieder Deutschland, to raise arms and the sounds of Heil Hitler. Adolf Hitler dominating the continent, controlling people's personal lives, and eliminating barriers between public and private. With the more profound issue, according to Mr. Moeller, and these books I got from Case, by the way, thanks, they were free. What could lead millions of German people to sacrifice and abandon individual rights and personal freedoms in the interest of dictatorial collective goals and national security? What carrots accompanied those stakes? How could millions of German people blindly support a regime that ruled through raw, naked terrorism and repression, as he explores how fragile democracy can be and how vital it is for each and every one of us to fully understand the forces that threaten. Soon as von Hindenburg capitulated, the Chancellor had a shadow coalition government at the ready to implement a whole new campaign, dissolve Parliament, called for new elections, burned down the Reichstag, suspended civil liberties, and worked quickly to further consolidate power. Instituted through the Enabling Act, better known as Gesetzgebung der Not von Volk und Reich, by amendment to the Weimar Republic Constitution, gave the power to enact laws without involvement of the German Parliament, creating a legal dictatorship. Sound familiar? Wake up! Using democratic means to eliminate democratic governance. Elimination of all political parties, use of extrajudicial authority to suppress dissent and opposition via police, Gestapo, state police, stormtroopers, sent trained unionists into exile, controlled media through propaganda, burned books, suppressed degenerate arts and culture, gypsies, blacks, gays, biracials, mentally infirmed, disabled, sick, labeled misfits for sterilization, crime to marry, it was a crime to marry outside your race, developed concentration camps, and revoked Jewish citizenship. Angered after World War II's Treaty of Versailles, which took away German colonies, reduced the country's land mass significantly, drastically reduced the nation's military and munitions, demanded monetary reparations to compensate the victims for their losses, installed the Weimar Republic government, imposed state regulation creating privation, massive shortages through austerity, which perpetuated economic instability and political challenges. Moeller said anti-Semitism was at the core of Hitler's worldview. By 1933, Hitler was characterized as a subversive force of incalculable power, and that was an understatement. The undertaking was initiated when ambitious men saw political opportunity with the impending global economic collapse, affecting this nation where too few prospered at the expense of too great a mass who could not buy bread. Certain folk could not hold civil service jobs. They were ordered to change their names, wear yellow Star of David patches on their clothing. There were colonies of refugees, mass immigration. Houses were bulldozed and razed. There was mass utility disruption. Constant bombing, dead bodies in the streets, property confiscation of land and belongings appropriated by others to others. The regime's new concentration camps developed, and mass extermination as the final solution to the ethno-indigenous problem was in full swing. Bent on racial selection based on features, hair, eye color, the preservation of full-blood Aryan people as an absolute national political necessity was oppressed. There's so much more to tell. But in closing, because there's not a lot of time today, what was the political cost? So by the time May 8th, 1945 rolled around, culminating with the Reich's unconditional surrender and Hitler's suicide pact with Eva Braun in the bunker that day, supposedly. Thousands of Afro-German women were sterilized. 50,000 homosexual men were persecuted. 267,000 people had been euthanized. 1.5 million German women were raped. Allied bombs had killed 400,000 German soldiers. 70% of the housing stock had been destroyed. 7.5 million Germans were homeless. Between 1944 and 1945, he estimates that 500,000 people were killed in the process of trying to escape. 5 million uniformed German soldiers lost their lives before the shootings finally stopped. 1 million died before release from Soviet death camps, or Soviet camps. And 6 million European Jews, it is estimated, were systematically executed. We are witnessing some of these same atrocities today in Palestine against Palestinian men, women, and children who are being slaughtered. And it has got to stop now. Thank you. So now it is my distinct pleasure to bring forward Batin Odeh. Batin Odeh is a history and journalism teacher at Al Ishan School of Excellence in Cleveland and an adult educator through the Aspire program at the Cuyahoga County Library. Batin is also the co-founder of the Masanda Family Literacy Organization, which claims to bring families together through story times, family activities, and other educational programs. She graduated with her undergraduate degrees in political science and journalism before obtaining her master's degree in history education from East Carolina University. Prior to graduate school, she interned for Congressman Kucinich in 2011 and worked with a refugee resettlement agency in Cleveland. She received her TESOL certification from the University of Akron in 2016 through Project Achieve. Batin is currently working on a novel and a documentary with filmmaker Diana Musa, which aims to tell the narratives of those with ties in the West Bank. At this time, I'd like to bring forth Batin Odeh.
Thank you, Genevieve, for your warm introduction. Greetings and may peace be upon you all. It brings me great pleasure to be introducing our guest speaker. Noura Erakat is a human rights attorney and an assistant professor at George Mason University. Her research interests include human rights law, humanitarian law, national security law, refugee law, social justice, and critical race theory. She has taught international human rights law in the Middle East at Georgetown University since spring 2009. Nura is a co-founding editor of Jadaliyya, an electronic magazine on the Middle East that combines scholarly expertise and local knowledge. She is the author of Justice for Some, Law, and in the Question of Palestine, which was set to come out this April, but is actually being pulled back there. Yay! Make sure you get your copy. She served as legal counsel for the Domestic Policy Subcommittee of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee in the House of Representatives from 2007 to 2009. Prior to her time on Capitol Hill, Nura received a New Voices Fellowship to work as the national grassroots organizer and legal advocate at the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. There, she helped seed BDS campaigns nationally as well as support the cases brought against 2 former Israeli officials in U.S. federal courts for alleged war crimes. Nura worked as a legal advocacy coordinator for the Baghdad Center for Refugee and Residency Rights from 2010 to 2013. In that capacity, she drafted their submissions to the human rights treaty bodies and lobbied the U.S. Congress as well as diplomatic missions at the United Nations on their behalf. During her undergraduate career, Nura helped launch the Divestment campaign along with the Students for Justice in Palestine at UC Berkeley in 2001. She currently serves on the board of the Institute for Policy Studies, on the board of the Arab Studies Institute, is a policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, serves on the editorial committee of the Journal for Palestine Studies, and is a founding board member of the DC Palestinian Film and Arts Festival. Nura spent the spring 2010 academic semester in Beirut, Lebanon, where she worked with human rights attorney Nizab Saghia. Nura helped Saghia establish the Legal Agenda, a Lebanon-based NGO dedicated to studying law and society. This NGO advocates for legal reform in the Arab world through civic and judicial empowerment. She has helped to initiate and organize several national formations, including ANWAJ, Arab Women Arising for Justice, and the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, USPCN. Ms. Erakat has appeared on several media networks, including CBS News, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, PBS, BBC, Democracy Now!, NPR, and Al Jazeera America. Her publications have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Review of Books, the LA Times, The Nation, USA Today, The Hill, Foreign Policy, Jezebel, Al-Ahram English, Al-Shabaka, Marib, Fair Observer, Middle East Eye, The Interdependent, International Law Girls, The Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, and Jadaliyah. As we say in Arabic, MashaAllah, this woman is truly amazing. It brings me great honor to welcome Noura Erakat on behalf of the Cleveland Peace Action.
That was too long. I'm sorry you had to endure that. I found that, the bios I actually appreciated the most. This was so generous and so kind. But the bios I've come to appreciate the most are the ones where somebody who's introducing me just tells the audience how I made them feel at some point. Because in fact, all of these things that we produce are fleeting and aren't necessarily demonstrative of our character. And so I think that understanding how it is that I might have made you feel, for me has become more meaningful, especially as one thinks about the meaning of life, existential questions, and so on and so forth. And so thank you so much for having me here. Thank you for the work that you do, for convening, for being relentless in your activism, in your time on a Sunday to be here. The intergenerational nature of this audience speaks to the community that you're building, and I know Cleveland is not an easy place to do this work. I have personal experience here with dear friend Josh Stacker and Pete Moore, who invited me both to Kent State as well as to the esteemed City Club of Cleveland. Where folks were very expressive about how they did not like what I was saying. And apparently they really didn't like what Ilan Pape was saying. And so y'all are fighting the fight. And it comes with great sacrifice. And it comes with a lot of heartache. And a lot of times we don't look around just to look at one another and remind one another that we are human. The work that we do, we're doing from a volunteer basis. This is the most thankless work. The most thankless work. If you do anything well, there's oftentimes people who want to tear you down because they think that you're taking up space because we exist like lobsters in a barrel. And if you aren't doing anything, people are talking about you because you're not mobilizing. And if you are doing something and you're making traction, then you're probably going to be targeted and accused of being a bigot, an anti-Jewish bigot, or punished with the revocation of your job or other opportunities. So the fact that you continue to do this work speaks to, we're all a little crazy. We're all a little nuts. But that's the only way the world has ever changed. It's in having that deep faith and immovable conviction that there is no other way, that there is no other path forward, And so even though all rational indicators repeatedly tell us that this is not worth it, the burnout, the heartache, the backbiting, the thanklessness, the lack of opportunity, the canary mission profiles that are scaring our students to death, and yet we keep on keeping, that is a testament to how this is work, this is love work. This is love work. And that's why we continue, and that's why this love work has to be based on our relationships to one another. And so that list that you heard, thank you, Captain, again. But let me tell you something else. That list that you heard, all my opportunities to publish, my job right now, my appearances on television, the blasphemy, the Palestinians speaking for Palestinians on behalf of themselves, of how they feel, right? All of that represents movement victories. All of it. It's not because I'm special. It's because our movement knocked down doors to make sure we had opportunities and made those differences. I'm going to talk about that movement a little bit. I've been asked to address BDS, and I know that Jeff, thank you Jeff, thank you Don, thank you Mark. Hi Abbas, thank you for leading our community so selflessly for so many decades. Thank you friends in this audience. But I remember when we were talking, they were saying, let's talk about BDS and how exciting it is. And I said, you know Palestinians have problems with BDS, right? That there is internal controversy as well. So what I want to do in this talk is talk a little bit about BDS while also not shying away from talking about the problematique around BDS and where we're at and maybe where we're headed. So as you heard, I was involved in a divestment campaign at UC Berkeley in 2001. And if you know, the tripartite call for BDS was issued by the BNC in 2005. So we have been doing this work for 4 years before it was announced as a global movement. And we did that work at Berkeley. We did that work as Students for Justice in Palestine in the context of the second Intifada. Really not the second Intifada, because Palestinians have been uprising much more than only twice. And if we want to count those massive uprisings, then this is at least the third Intifada if you count the first Great Revolt between 1936 and 1939. But in 2000, what has come to be known as the militarized uprising of Palestinians, the one that marked the end, in my opinion, of the two-state solution and showed the face of the bankruptcy of the Oslo peace process, is when we as young students at Berkeley looked around and said, this is, I want to swear so I remember that's not appropriate ever in our church. This is not right. Okay, this is not okay. And how come we have to, why is it that this keeps getting refracted through this false parity between Israelis and Palestinians when there's no parity at all?
Correct.
There's a state that is a nuclear power, the only nuclear power in the Middle East, the largest recipient of U.S. aid in the world, of military and financial aid, the empire's most unique ally, the 11th most powerful military in the world, and then there are people who are stateless, scattered, refugees, who are subject to all forms of vulnerability and violence. And yet you would think that it was Palestinians who have invaded Israel and demolished Israeli homes and shot to kill Israeli children as the world applauded them for acting in self-defense. It boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. And so we said, well, part of the problem is the analytical framework through which this issue is being refracted. So long as it's called the peace process, then we conceive of it as rapprochement, or rapprochement, I don't speak any French, obviously, between two warring peoples. But what that does is it elides that power difference that is constantly shaping the condition of Palestinian and Israeli lives. And so as students, we did what most students do, which is be incredibly bold. Our students are leading this movement. Our students are the ones taking the greatest risks. They're the ones who are daring to dream and put their bodies on the line. And it's constantly students who are leading us. And in that moment, it was students who said, this is not a peace process, this is apartheid. And being the Berkeley students that we were, we also decided that as an anarchist organization that had no hierarchy but functioned on horizontal leadership, that we would just block the campus without permission, without a permit to protest, and we unfurled a banner declaring that Israel is an apartheid state, blocked Seder Gate. There are, if you know anybody, Berkeley alums, Bears? Right here. What's your name? Nina? Nina? That's one of my favorite names. Nina, because I like Nina Simone. Okay, so Miss Nina, fellow Bear. You know Seder Gate has 3 arches. One large arch and 2 small arches. So we blocked the major arch, and then on one of the small arches it said, for Jews only, right? And all students can pass by freely. Get on your way to class. Nobody will impede your movement. And on the other side, it was a checkpoint for Palestinians, where we performed guerrilla theater. And we basically, it was like a pop-up protest before pop-ups became a thing. And we began as 25 students and ended up as some 300 students. And the divestment movement was born on university campuses and spread, and it was before anybody took, before BDS had a name, before anybody took these crazy kids seriously, right? And within a few months, we took over another building during midterms, chained the doors, declared that the building was occupied, and if they thought that it was annoying and inconvenient, they should go see what military occupation over a prolonged period of time looked like. We also built a refugee camp in the middle of campus, and we basically, we were a provocation. We were a provocation. And many times when you think, well, what is this gonna do? Have you gotten anybody to change any laws? Have you raised any monies? Have you stopped a home from being demolished? Maybe not, but look where we are now. That was in 2001. We began on February 6, 2001, when Ariel Sharon was elected for a second time. Okay? So we already knew where Israeli society was on these questions and where the US was. Now we're in 2019, in we're in March 2019. Math, 18 years. 18 years later, Harold Poor of AIPAC announces to an audience that BDS is the second most significant risk to Israel after a nuclear-capable Iran. Also a bit of an exaggeration, because they want to criminalize this movement and smear those who are part of a peace and justice movement led with love. But that's the significance of this. Right now, there are 41 states in the United States of America that have either passed legislation condemning BDS, criminalizing it, or have proposed legislation. 26 states have proposed, 15 states right now have proposed legislation. 26 states it's already passed, including Ohio. HB 476, and I think more recently in 2018, HCR 10. And so we also know that we're doing something right. It's no longer these crazy kids, now it's a serious movement. There's money. Israel has dedicated a fund of $25 million to stem the global BDS movement. Do you know how much the BDS movement functions on? How much you all have? What you got in your pockets? That's it. That's it. The richness and the wealth that we have is that conviction and that love that continues to move us. That is why no amount of money, no amount of legislation, no amount of smearing, no amount of scaring us is stopping this movement. It's stopping this movement. That's why we have only recently tremendous victories, including the National Women's Studies Association, the Asian American Studies Association, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Which one am I forgetting? Is it? And American Studies Association, which is the largest one, thanks Josh, with 5,000 members. okay? All endorse academic boycott, which was one of the most difficult forms of boycott to endorse because of the way that we think, this liberal idea that we have around academic freedom, right? That's going to be the hardest. You know what the other hard one is? Cultural boycott. Because we also have this liberal conception. Culture makes us all come together. Culture makes us friends. Culture makes us love one another. Yeah, but culture also gets us up to resist. Culture also makes us believe that a different future is possible. That is what protest music is. That's what Nina Simone sings to my heart when she says, Mississippi, goddamn. That's what culture is. Let's use it to resist, not to placate. That is why Miss Lauryn Hill refused to perform in Israel. That is why Michael Bennett, defensive lineman of the NFL, refused to travel to Israel on a junket. That is why Lorde refused to perform in Israel. These are cultural boycott victories. Elvis Costello, Roger Waters, the Pink something.
Floyd.
No, not Roger Waters. I know there's these three women, the Pixie Girls, right? Dixie Chicks. Thank you, Dixie Chicks. I did not mean anything by that. Just to name a few, and this is on the cultural level of boycott. These are hard-won victories. They're not like economic victories. They're not like they're not like what our brothers and sisters in the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church USA have done, which is also tremendous, which is get over this idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition that makes it blasphemous to condemn Israel's human rights violations, which is why it's so difficult. But they too have passed divestment resolutions and divested from companies that profit from human rights violations, right? So these are the strides, and it continues to grow. It's that idea that we don't die, we multiply, right? We don't die, we multiply. You can scatter us, but we spread like seeds and we continue to grow. And so it becomes so much more difficult to stop this movement. It's one of the biggest complaints is why can't we be more unified and centralized, and if only we functioned more in a more organized fashion. Here's just my word to the wise on that. I get it. That's typically how we conceive of power. That's typically how traditional power functions. But the source and power of BDS has been its decentralized nature. And been the fact that there is not a bank account. Been the fact that there is not a central headquarters. Been the fact that every single one of you can believe and own that you are the leader of a BDS movement where you are. Right? So the greatest critique that you can offer is also our greatest strength. And let's use that strength to continue forward. So what I want to do really quickly is review the history of the BDS movement and then move on to talk a little bit about why did I mention that it's also controversial? Why are Palestinians frustrated with BDS? Anybody here frustrated with BDS? Okay, we can talk about it. I'm going to air some of our laundry. But it's good because it's analytical fodder for us to think about what is freedom for a colonized people who are facing off with settler colonial eliminatory violence. And what does BDS do what does it do to stem that eliminatory violence? And we'll find that that's where the controversy is, because in many ways it can't stem it, and we need more. BDS is necessary, but insufficient. And so that's what Palestinians are grappling with. And then, part of where we're at right now is the fact that our greatest successes, which I'll get to, we have to thank Israel for that. Right? We're all doing a great job. Israel's doing the best job at making BDS one of the only options left for us. Right? And again, necessary but insufficient. So really, really quickly, the history of BDS. Folks must be familiar with this. We know that in 2005, that's when the second Intifada was ending, which lasted between 2000 and 2005. 5,000 Palestinians were killed. This was but it's also the moment where there was a spike in suicide bombings within Israel proper, there were greater attacks, and it really struck at the core of Israeli anxiety about the specter of Palestinian violence and the existential nature of Jewish life. So why in 2000 did this intifada, unlike the first intifada, take on such a militarized character has much to do with the fact that during the second intifada, Palestinians were lightly armed. About 9,000 police officers had guns for the first time. How? Because the U.S. wanted to build a Palestinian police force in order to police whom? Palestinians. And to protect Israelis from Palestinians. But in 2000, after 7 years of Oslo, during which we see 100% increase in the number, 200% increase in the number of settlements, what became obvious is that Oslo was a trap. Oslo was not the path forward. And so the writing that was on the wall that Edward Said told us about, immediately that this should have been our Treaty of Versailles because it was a capitulation, came fully apparent. And there's questions around Oslo. Many people say, well, the problem with Oslo is that we just didn't have good negotiators. And that was the problem. There weren't enough good negotiators. They came into the room without maps. That's not true. We had fabulous negotiators in Madrid and in Washington. Fabulous negotiators who were astute, who were trained, who were legal experts, including Reja Shahadeh, right? Including Camille Mansour, including Hanan Ashrawi, including Haidar Abd al-Shafi. But there was treason within the PLO when the head of the PLO, namely the chairman, Yasser Arafat, and Mahmoud Abbas, initiated secret negotiations in Norway. That's where they agreed to every single term that the Palestinian negotiators rejected in Washington. In secret. In secret. And so this isn't about poor negotiation skills, okay? And this isn't about the fact that, oh, but if Israel had just abided by the terms of the document, then things would have been different. The entire document was set up to establish a sovereignty trap, a perpetual condition of derivative sovereignty that can only be obtained in reward for participation in our own subjugation. Is that too many ins? Should I say that again?
Yes, please.
Alright, no, it's cool, it's cool. You have to code switch a little bit. We set up an arrangement where Palestinians were rewarded for their good behavior. And our good behavior was our willingness to police ourselves and to protect Israel's sovereignty over the entire West Bank and Gaza. And in exchange for that good behavior, we were given treats. Okay? We were given small treats. You can drive on these roads. Some of you will have VIP passes to travel everywhere. Some of you will get contracts, international contracts that you've never had before in order to be able to now trade goods. Some of you will be able to build mansions and real estate companies. Some of you will be able to enter into agricultural business with Israelis, right, and economic cooperation. So there was extreme benefit that was coming from this arrangement of derivative sovereignty, right, which is why it can be sustained for so long. Which is why it still remains a trap for us. So, by 2000, these things that Edward Said and Mahmoud Darwish and Haidar Abd al-Shafi, he never attended the signing on the White House lawn, that they had all warned us about, basically became apparent. That this wasn't just a bad peace agreement. The agreement was doing precisely what it was set out to do, which is to trap us perpetually into Bantustans and into reservations, but never into an independent state. Because there was no controversy amongst Palestinians that we were okay with a state in the West Bank and Gaza, which was one of the most radical shifts in Palestinian thought. To shift from a declaration and an affirmation of a single state solution, which is enshrined in 1968 by the Palestinian National Council and in the Palestinian Charter, It's in 1988 the most radical shift in thinking happens, which is when we accept a state-led as the source of Palestinian liberation. And in fact, it's Mohammed Darwish who writes the Declaration of Independence and Sa'id who translates it into English. So nobody's upset about, well, some people are, obviously. I should know better as someone trained in law. Some people are upset, but the massive consensus is that the two-state solution is a source of our liberation. Okay? So that's not what Palestinians are upset about. It's the fact that even the agreement we signed didn't ever guarantee that state, but would only guarantee our reservation. Right? Now, that's because Palestinians have declared their struggle as a struggle for self-determination, which is a concept that solidifies in 1960 as a legal concept that is equated to the self-governance of a people. Self-governance of a people. It's at the moment of third world upheaval where colonialism is condemned as an illegitimate form of governance, that this concept is solidified. So for many decades, Palestinians have equated our liberation with the establishment of a state, with the fulfillment of the League of Mandate's unfulfilled promise of independence for Palestinians. Obviously, there's also been internal thought, and a lot of Palestinian thought of, is it really the state that we want? Or is it the destruction of imperialism and racism, as some elements in Palestinian society have advocated? And what we see right now, and this is something that Chase also made apparent, in our return to Black-Palestinian solidarity, it's a return to the concept of freedom beyond the state. I mean, y'all can ask me about that in Q&A. But I want to read to you something. In 1976, the same proposal that is made to Palestinians, okay, the same proposal that is made to Palestinians in the form of these Bantustans, self-governing territories, the West Bank, in the first phase of Oslo, Palestinians would become sovereign or control of security and civilian control of something like 18% of all the West Bank and Gaza. Okay, that's it. All of it. And if you look at the map and you look at those shaded areas, and in fact I have one of the maps in the book, not a shameless plug, okay? That is the status quo condition, okay? We, the international community, has celebrated that arrangement as peacemaking, has poured millions and millions of dollars to make it livable. USAID has been all over the West Bank building life roads. Passage of life roads, you know what those are? The roads for Palestinians that are created so that they can go under Israeli settlements or around Israeli settlements. So we're basically making the Israeli settlements more livable, right? So the entire international community is basically cooperating to make Israel's status quo, its settler colonial enterprise, something that Palestinians can live with, okay? That is what all this money is poured into, and we celebrate that as achievement. In 1976, when apartheid South Africa proposed the same arrangement in black homelands, the General Assembly unanimously in Resolution 31-6A condemned, quote, the establishment of Bantustans as designed to consolidate the inhuman policies of apartheid, to destroy the territorial integrity of the country, to perpetuate white minority domination, and to dispossess the African people of South Africa of their inalienable rights. So this same arrangement that we very forthrightly as an international community condemned in 1976 as the perpetual subjugation of a people, we now celebrate since 1993 as the source of freedom and peacemaking for Palestinians. I'm not that great at math, but that doesn't add up. That just doesn't add up. And yet we have a Palestinian political and economic elite that is committed to this arrangement, that has become part of the structure that maintains this arrangement. It could not function without Palestinian participation. It could not function. without Palestinians in security coordination, in economic coordination, who are committed to Oslo, who have bifurcated a political track from a rights-based track since 1993. Okay? So one of the things, let me tell you a little bit more about the document, about the peace agreement. Okay? Throughout the Palestinian Liberation Organization enters the UN foray in 1974 for the first time. Okay? Between 1974 and about 1982, they were at the forefront of what you would call guerrilla diplomacy. Okay? They basically came in to take it down. Right? They created new laws. They established alternatives to Resolution 242. They inscribed the juridical status of Palestinians in UN legal instruments because, as Golda Meir tells the world, okay, maybe it's good that we don't know this. What? Black Palestinians made up a bunch of Bedouins from around these Arab countries who just come because they're driven by their hatred for Jews. Yeah, right, because Palestinians have lived all their life suffering because they really just want to mess up Jewish life. I mean, that's the source of this dehumanization. You have to believe that Palestinians literally are not human to live their life to ruin another people's life. And not that they're driven by a love for freedom and a love of self and a love of their families and a love of others around them. Okay, but that's what Golda Meir explains to us. That's what the Balfour Declaration, it erases the juridical status of Palestinians. That's what 242 does. Security Council Resolution 242 does the same thing because it only recognizes Palestinians as a refugee problem. And here comes the PLO into the UN. And they basically say, we are a people. And the PLO is the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And we will be represented in the General Assembly with non-member observer status. Resolutions 3236, 3237, 3210. That's how they establish themselves, okay? So this is the height of guerrilla diplomacy. And they shake things up. They passed Resolution 3379 in 1975. Nerds? Anyone?
Zionism is racism.
Zionism is a form of racism. Right? That's what they were doing. Now, fast forward to 1993. Check out the document. None of these laws, none of these strides are included in the peace agreement. Zero. Not 3210, not 23236, not 3379. In fact, the PLO rescinds 3379. Rescinds it as a condition for entering the peace agreement. Not 194 on the right of return, not any of the resolutions declaring the indivisibility of Jerusalem and the status of Jerusalem as an international status that's established in 181. Not UN resolution, G8 resolution 181, nothing. The only reference to law in the peace agreement is a passing mention of resolutions 242 and 338. Okay, and mind you, remember that in 1967, 242 is condemned by the PLO. It's in fact what leads the Palestinian guerrillas, led by Yasser Arafat on one hand and others, to take over the PLO from Arab hands. Because it's established by Jamal Abdel Nasser originally to be an Arab, Palestine is a derivative of an Arab nationalist struggle. And after 242, which is considered a massive failure, Palestinians take over the PLO and say, this is our business now. Because nobody's doing it right. Okay? But it becomes, and it was a condition that Palestinians need to accept 242 in order to enter into negotiations. So for 20 years, the United States says, you must recognize Israel, you must agree to 242 to enter negotiations. Finally, Palestinians do that in 1988. Finally, they enter into these agreements. And the peace agreement, Israel doesn't want to establish 242 as a guiding law, because if they do, they have to retreat to the 1967 borders, and they have no intentions of doing that. Because they want the settlements to be permanent under a new framework that they established through negotiations. So the only reference in the peace agreement is a reference to 242 and 338 in passing. And check this out, it gets even worse. The peace agreement, not in English, let me tell you in English, says that the parties will have fulfilled the mandate of 242 and 338 if the parties agree to stay. Does that sound circular and nonsensical to you? Meaning, there's two ways that law can work. Either law will be prescriptive. It will tell you what you must do in order to be in compliance with it, right? Or the law can be descriptive. It can represent what your agreement is and say that it has been fulfilled. And they basically agreed to the only two General Assembly Security Council resolutions that they included in this peace agreement, that they shall have a descriptive function, which meant there was no human rights, there was no laws of war, there were no other resolutions that would manage the relationship between Palestinians and Israel. It would only be political agreement. It would only be a political agreement that would suffice. And that political agreement would no longer be internationally mediated. It would be bilateral negotiations between the Palestinians alone and Israel and the most honest broker in the world, fair arbiter, representative of justice and peace all over, the United States of America. Okay? That was Oslo. All right? That was Oslo. And in 2000, when we see the limits of Oslo and the inability to actually change the facts on the ground, to actually bring about Palestinian liberation, Palestinians uprise, right? And Camp David falls apart. Now, and Arafat actually refuses the terms, which he would have signed away Palestinian refugee rights forever, right? When that peace process collapses, and Ariel Sharon enters into Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, in September 2000, and with 1,000 troops in an act of provocation, this is when the Intifada, the second Intifada begins, and it's much more militarized. It's much more militarized, it's not as grassroots, it's not as intergenerational, it's not as gender, there's not much less gender parity. And because now we have frontiers within the West Bank, it's also happening at the checkpoints. All the confrontations between Israeli armed forces and Palestinians are happening at checkpoints, are happening between areas A and B, or between areas A and C, right? So it's no longer, now the Intifada is no longer permeating through Palestinian homes. It's literally only in certain areas, and people who are there are armed, right? So this was a game changer. This was a game changer. And for the Palestinian grassroots movement, they see this and they say, yo, we messed up. This is a failure. Backtrack. We needed a different path forward. And the Palestinian government is committed. We have to stick to this. We have to stick this out, because if we are behaving well enough, we will get our state. And the split is between politics only, where Israel and the Palestinians negotiate, and between rights, rather than a framework where rights undergird and create more leverage for those political negotiations. And that's when we begin to see the emergence of the BDS movement that's led by the largest swath of Palestinian civil society in 2005, when they launch the BNC call, right? Where they say, forget the political outcome. We don't want a political outcome. We want to make this 3 rights-based demands. The right of return for all Palestinian refugees, the equality of Palestinian Israelis as full-on citizens, and the end of all occupation, including in the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. I said the Sinai. I meant Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And that creates a palpable split. You can feel it in Palestinian society between the political track and the human rights track, when really they should be one and the same. When really they should be one and the same. All right, so when BDS is launched, it's launched in order to fill a gap that's been left by the Palestinian leadership. It's launched in order to bring back everybody who is in global solidarity with Palestinians who have been disaffected by the conditions of politics, right? And the backroom dealings. It resurrects the framework of Palestine as a justice issue and not as a conflict issue, right? How many of you studied peace and conflict studies? Okay, no longer there. This is about justice. And BDS has done that work. BDS has done that work to resurrect Palestine as a justice issue, to mobilize the international community, to fill the space that's been left by the Palestinian leadership. But what it has not done is developed a political program, right? So what? What happens when we get these rights and the refugees return and we end the occupation? What's the vision? What's the vision? What does this new society look like? And the BNC will not answer that question because they rightly so say, we're not the PLO. Nobody elected us to represent them. We're a grassroots movement demanding human rights. That is the work of a political leadership, not the work of our work as a human rights kind of led mandate. So now you have a massive gap between being able to mobilize not just Palestinians, but Israelis as well. You need to be able to offer Israelis something better than Israel is offering them. You need to offer them a vision and a future that is more promising than what Israel has offered. And we, as a Palestinian movement, frankly, the national movement has non-existent, right? And don't have that vision to offer. We have other things that we offer, things that are a bit, underdeveloped, for a lack of another word, right? This idea of one person, one vote. Why don't we just have a democracy where we all live here? And we can all get along as equals. But as we have learned, in this country and in other places, from the right, Mark and I were talking about this, the women's suffrage movement, women got the right to vote. They didn't dismantle patriarchy. There's a lot of people in this country who believe that racism no longer exists, and the only racism that does exist is anti-whiteness. Because young white people don't get equal opportunity in colleges because of affirmative action and reverse discrimination. Right? 1964, 1965, we get black suffrage. Right? We haven't dismantled racism. In fact, we made it even harder to talk about racism because we believe we were in a post-racial society. And won't have those discussions of how it comes to constitute everything that we know about our identity and our anxieties and about deprivation. And in the same way, you can't just have equality for Palestinians if you don't talk about settler colonization. If you don't talk about the removal of an entire people. If you don't talk about their dehumanization, their erasure, their dispersion, their massacre, their territorial claims, their trauma, their homes, right? And we saw this conflict come up in Palestine when a group of youth boarded a bunch of settler buses. You might have been familiar with this. A group of youth boarded settler buses in order to basically demonstrate, and they were inspired by the Freedom Riders. And so they do it in order to demonstrate the evils of segregation. And there was pushback from Palestinian society that said, we're not mad about segregation. We don't just want to ride the bus. We want the land that the bus is on back. Because these are native claims. These are native claims. There is a relationship between an indigenous community, their history and their family, to those lands, and that needs to be talked about. And there needs to be some dealing. So this isn't just about equality. This is about justice and restorative justice. And that's the task at hand. And BDS doesn't have the answers to those questions. BDS does not have the answers. BDS is necessary but insufficient. And BDS is not a national movement. BDS is a solidarity movement. It only works if you do it. You could have a bunch of Palestinians, BDS, 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 right? And we did. We had the largest boycott in 1936, a tax revolt, no longer refused to pay British taxes under British colonial rule, refused to buy goods. We could do that. That's not the same thing with what's being asked right now. What's being asked right now is help us overcome diplomatic intransigence and the sovereignty trap that Oslo has placed us in by demanding these rights on our behalf. And the only way it works is if you believe what Palestinians are saying to you. It's kind of pathetic, actually. It's kind of pathetic. Because we have to convince you to believe us. And if you believe us and you do something about it, that's where our hope lies. So where is the Palestinian agency in this? That national movement piece is missing. And the reason that it's missing is not a coincidence, because almost all forms of Palestinian resistance have been criminalized, right? We went to the ICJ, to the International Court of Justice. What did Scott McLennan say at the time after the Court of Justice ruled that the route of the wall was illegal? He explained, quote, "We do not believe that the ICJ is an appropriate forum to resolve what is a political issue." We went to the ICC, and now the United States is going to defund the ICC and withdraw, and so is Israel. I went to law school so I could sue Israelis. They wasted my time in law school. I went to law school so I could sue Israelis in U.S. courts. Both lawsuits were dismissed on justiciable grounds, which meant that they were never heard on their merits, right? So these legal avenues have been foreclosed. Obviously, there's no longer a context of third world revolt, so the idea of armed struggle and revolution has been cast out of time and place as terroristic violence. So that avenue has been foreclosed. In grassroots uprising, we saw it. We saw it this year. 45,000 Palestinians marching for peace. You should have had the whole world on their feet, praising this freedom movement. Instead, they got massacred. 58 people on the largest day of their protest. Massacred. Shot in their backs. Fleeing. Armless. Meaning not armless, but without arms, without military arms. And if you read the Israeli Supreme Court decision, they frame everything, the Molotov cocktails, the burning tires, the incendiary kites, as lethal threats. In an interview with the Washington Post, the military general who was responsible, when he was asked, why don't you just use water cannons to push the Palestinians back if you're worried about the frontier? And his response was, there's not adequate range. There's not adequate range for the water cannon. So come on, let's do the math again. If there's not adequate range for the water cannon, how is there adequate range for those Molotov cocktails to hurt anybody? That children, some of them, these are children that are being shot. I've been counting this. 90% of the fatalities were Palestinians being shot above the waist, in the chest, back, neck, and head. This was not self-defense, this was a massacre. And yet, it was hailed as Israel's right to self-defense. So, how do we overcome this trap? How do we overcome these conditions? Well, one thing I told you in the beginning is that Israel is doing a lot of the work for us, right? They passed a nation-state law and basically declared that this is a state for Jews, it's not a state for its citizens.
I remember Israel being the only country that was always so-called democracy, which was a big supporter and supplier of arms to South Africa during the struggle there. I wonder if you can provide that.
Sure.
You were a student at UC Berkeley, and you teach now in college. Many people are organizing BDS on campus. There are a number of different issues around micro and macro aggressions in terms of crypto Zionists or liberal Zionists, or even those who may be Sephardic or Mizrahi or evangelical. and oftentimes it is blatant in their expression. And there's a lot of, what do you feel some concrete actions can be taken to minimize the attacks among those who are organizing at BDS? Because oftentimes it's not necessarily more overt or bellicose in terms of that, even with the left. It is there is some repetitious organizing to undermine and develop threats and neutralize these particular activities. And also includes the terminations of other people organizing. And have you ever had that experience of whether you felt that could be terminated or other experience in terms of retribution from universities and so forth?
All right, let's do one more in this set and then we'll work on the next set. So we'll do 3.
Thank you so much for coming. I came to hear a little bit about Black-Palestinian sovereignty, and I direct people in the audience to the Cleveland Peace Action website, and there's an article there which you wrote which is called Black-Palestinian Solidarity is a Choice. So I'm going to raise that, but before I ask you about it, do you know what's the situation with Joy Correga, where you're going tomorrow at Oberlin?
I do not.
She was terminated several years ago, or I think right after 2014, an African-American professor who was terminated like Steve Salita was for her social media. So maybe you could own up on that a little bit by tomorrow. I know you're traveling. She was a popular African-American professor who's gone. She's in federal court in Cleveland right now, suing for $800,000. So we're going to try to follow that. But what are the why is Black-Palestinian solidarity important, and what are the nuts and bolts? And I would have wished that we could have had this meeting in an African-American church on the east side, because we would have had a 50-50 black other audience. And so any thoughts you have on that? Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely. Which, by the way, would have been its own lecture, right? Which would have been its own lecture. No, you're right to ask that question. Let me start there. Let me start with Black-Palestinian transnational solidarity. I'm going to give a mini rundown on it, okay? The reason I say it's a choice is because this is not based on identity politics. Blacks and Palestinians are not aligned with one another because I'm Palestinian, therefore I must align with black people. That's not how it works. This is a political commitment and a political vision for the future, which is why in the work that we've done, there's been a lot of fallout. A lot of Palestinians are anti-black and want to distinguish themselves from black communities and insist that we have a noble cause. We were wronged by the League of Nations. Black people are thugs and criminals and have done this to themselves. And black folks, including elected representatives who have said it to me, will often say, we are not Palestinians. We've never launched a missile at white people. So don't compare us to those terrorists. Okay? There is disagreement. Just because you are Palestinian does not predetermine radical politics. Same with if you're black. It does not predetermine radical politics. This is about political consciousness. It's about choices one makes in their lives. Where do they align? What kind of future? Is it a socialist future? Is it a neoliberal future? Right? Is it a future where we're tackling misogyny and classism and racism? Or is it a future based on colorblindness, where we can have means of equal representation without a guarantee of equality? These are different political tracks. Even within the black movement, there are different political tracks. And you have cleavages between African Americans who believe in the political sovereignty that the greatest amount of freedom will be when blacks become fully equal citizens and become equal shareholders in the promise of the United States, versus the black radical tradition, which tells you this entire framework is flawed and have a vision of an abolitionist future, where the source, not just this idea, don't start just from the dismantlement of prison, okay? You want to walk that back to thinking about what is it that we describe as a crime, and how did one thing become a crime while another thing became a law-breaking activity. One is a legal designation that corresponds to incarceration. The other one is a description. And the distinction between those two things is is the source of what is actually driving our criminal justice system. So when we say let's dream about an abolitionist future, it says let's think about those questions. Who became a criminal? And who became somebody who made a mistake and got a second chance? Okay? Why is our penal population overrepresented by black men? They're really just doing more crimes? Seriously? Really? They caused our financial crisis and made people homeless in 2008? Really? They're going to bear the brunt. So think about what it is that we do. And the same kind of divergence in thought exists in the Palestinian community. I told you about it. I talked about it. Some Palestinians want a state at all costs and just want to be another member in the international community. They want to be a player in the game. And some Palestinians want to create a new world. We don't want borders at all. It's not working for us. We don't think y'all should have it either. And there are distinctions within Palestinians. And so when I say Black-Palestinian solidarity is a choice, it's that political alignment. And it's a political commitment to build a new future. It's not a transactional solidarity. I'm going to help you out with your people, you help me out with my people. It's a commitment to create a new future. And this return, I call it a renewal. It's not new. We saw it in 2014, but the first iterations of it, the most fervent iterations of it, emerged after the 1967 war. And specifically when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee basically comes to view Israel as an extension of U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. And the framework was not, it was about whatever the U.S. is doing to black people in the United States in order to racially subjugate them as a permanent caste, a lower caste, is an extension of U.S. imperial plunder in the rest of the world, and Israel is part of that. Which brings me to this other question about Israel's role with South Africa. In the UN, Israel, Portugal, and the United States were all condemned with one breath because of their role in imperialist excellence, right? Portugal was trying to hold down to Mozambique and Angola. South Africa is trying to hold on to Namibia and South Africa, apartheid leaders. And the U.S. is in Vietnam and trying to change the course of history. And so they are condemned in one breath as being part of a Western alliance, an evil alliance. That framework around Israel now fades from our memory, right? Fades from our memory because it's been cast as the only democracy in the Middle East in a sea of savages and whatnot. And that critique of other regimes, other Arab regimes and monarchies is true and is real, right? So it's not to excuse that, but it's also not to forget that that Israel is still part of this empire, of this imperial constellation. And so even though they're not providing arms to South Africa anymore, they are the primary exporters of security and surveillance technologies all over the world. All over the world. So that the largest favela in Brazil, they've named themselves Gaza. Okay? Because of the military technology and the surveillance technologies that are being used against them. The same can be said of technologies that we're seeing in the United States. Who's going to build the wall? The ones who perfected it. That's not a good look. It hasn't been a good look, right? The problem is, we forget that when we have a liberal administration and not a fascist one, right? So, maybe that was a slip of tongue. The point is, at least the white nationalist one. Supremacist one, okay. Micro and macro aggressions on campuses and how to combat this discourse. Look, politics is basically a competition, right? It's a competition over scarce resources. It's a competition over language. It's a competition over how we see the world. So how do you overcome the framing of BDS organizing and of Palestine organizing? How do you overcome the demonization of that organizing so that we understand it as a justice issue?
And it's attacks too. I'm talking about serious attacks, death threats.
Serious attacks, death threats, and the rest of it. There's no bullet. There's no silver bullet. If there was, I'd be distributing it and out of the academy because it would be a more worthwhile endeavor. There is no silver bullet, but look how far we've come. Look how far we've come. Where, and we see it going in cycles. There was a moment when Palestinian, for example, armed resistance was known as freedom fighters. That has been collapsed into terrorism for years, for decades. But we've also seen this other return to understanding what Israel is doing through a racial lens and a racial framework, and not just understanding it, and that's an analytical return as well. And now we're seeing other forms of return where Israel is increasingly being framed as a right-wing issue, as a conservative issue. And especially for young millennials who have not grown up in the history of '67 and in the trauma of the Holocaust, there's new opportunity to think about brighter futures. So here this brings up the conversation y'all are about to have about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, right? This whole idea of collapsing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not just hurtful because of the attacks that it creates, it's not just painful for that, but it's so painful because of the missed opportunities. The missed opportunities, because anti-Semitism is real, and we need to combat it, and it's part of the same progressive, radical vision of ending white supremacy and of ending Zionist settler colonial domination. And when we create a fissure between that vision, we're missing the opportunity to actually unite for a much more promising future for all, rather than just for some. Right? So, and what we saw in this latest attack on Ilhan Ahmad was that increasingly the most ardent Jewish Zionists in the United States are more concerned with protecting Israel than they are with protecting Jewish life. Right? I don't think it's about that. I don't think it's about that. It's not just about that. No. It's not just about money. No, I think that's overinflating. That's overinflating the Israel lobby's power. They are not that powerful. This is something that we've internalized as part of American culture. It's part of our ethos. Okay, the most widely read and sold book is The Exodus. This is a cultural norm. This is not about bribing anybody or scaring them. This is also an internalized cultural norm. It's about understanding Israel as the easternmost front against Muslim marauders coming to blow up the World Trade Center in the United States. Right? It's this framework where we have come to believe Israel is part of our national fabric. And that's not money. That's what we've been taught. That's what we culturally celebrate. It's a lot to unlearn. And people are committed to this because they believe in it. And because of this cultural shift, we're creating new systems of belief, which I think is the only way forward.
All right. Sorry. All right, we're going to go into the next question, which is here, and then we're going to hit Isaac, and then that gentleman here, and then I'll try and snake around to you two, and then I'll hit it next.
Hi, Andrew Bonfius. I'm president of Labor Education and Arts Project, and we endorsed this forum, but unfortunately, the fabricated motion over here at our table that says we endorsed BDS, and we did not. We did, however, pass a motion that said labor, education, arts unequivocally condemns targeting of civilians by both Israel and Hamas and opposes all theocratic states. Now, I have read the Hamas document of 2017, and there's one line in there about recognizing the 1967 borders, but that's entirely bracketed on both sides by a statements, plural, that clearly say that Israel from the Jordan River to the sea, or Palestine from the Jordan River to the sea, is unequivocally Arab and Islamic. So the one line that you think that they might say that it's okay for Jews to live in the area, to me is just fallacious. Now, you've talked eloquently, and rightly so, about the oppressive and terrible crimes that the Zionist state has made against the Palestinians. Absolutely, no question. You also talk about, a movement built out of love. But I haven't heard any statement today about why Hamas should not be considered part of this movement of of helping out Palestinian liberation. They're still a Jew-hating organization. You have rightly stated that Hamas has oppressed the Palestinian people. Please speak more about that. Please speak more about that. Noura Erakat has said in an interview, I heard it, and I think she agrees, that why...
It's a great question, y'all. It's a great question. It's a question you're going to get everywhere. I'll answer. Andrew, I will answer your question. It's a good question.
All right, we're going to go on to the next question over here.
I mean, as long as you don't ask me about chemistry and physics, I think I'm cool. All right? Just ask about something I know. Everything is fair game. All right.
So one of the things you brought up that I thought was, you brought up a lot of really interesting points that sort of reframe things. But one of them was sort of the, in a certain sense, sort of the limits of the human rights paradigm.
Yeah.
And the need for something more, but also sort of one, because of literal political oppression, either from the PLO or the PA or the Israelis, or something like that appeared. But also, I wanted to ask about what are the possibilities for that? Who is thinking about that within Palestinian politics? Where do things sit within Palestinian politics?
About the limits of human rights paradigms?
Without the limits of human rights paradigms and other, sort of the re-entry of a different kind of politics. Is that something that can go past the green line?
Okay.
All right, next question. How many do you think you can handle at one time?
I got a short one.
I have to get to these people first.
Hello. You spoke about two progressive candidates, the other two women, and I would like to know, do you feel it's just a matter of time that AIPAC comes after these two women? There's a term in Washington called, named after Cynthia McKinney, and then if you speak out and if you're too pro-Palestinian, it's just a matter of time before you're put on AIPAC's hit list. And we've seen, like, also from the Israeli lobbyists, how, from the Democratic Party, how they've turned against these women for speaking out.
Got you. Okay, I'm going to go backwards. I got you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go backwards. I'll start with that. I'll end with Hamas, okay? So with the two progressive candidates, I think we've already seen it. We have seen that there is a taboo being shattered. Even discussing that Palestinian is a human rights, Palestine and Palestinians is a human rights issue as opposed to a national security issue or opposed to a peacemaking process is the product of movement work and of academic knowledge production that has insisted this is a human rights issue. So all of that is something shifting, okay? I also want to caution us not to overinflate AIPAC's power. It's not like they suddenly have a hit list and it functions like that. There are a number of people who are deeply Zionist because they believe, okay, evangelicals believe that there must be the return of all Jews to historic Palestine in order for Armageddon. Okay, the Black church. There is a strand in the Black church that deeply believes that this is Zion for people that have been dispersed. Okay, there is a deep tradition amongst people who have an affinity to Israel that is not politically manufactured. And so that is a political culture that has been created in the United States. Now, what I think we can explain, there's political scientists in the room who can explain it better than me, right? So Josh, feel free to chime in. But in 1967, the U.S. pivots to Israel and shifts from maintaining a status quo between Arab monarchies and Israel that basically will keep them as a stalemate policy and will neutralize both camps in order to achieve U.S. interests in the Middle East. Everybody wants to be in the Middle East. That's a lot of natural resources and a lot of waterways and a lot of paths connecting Africa and Asia, East Asia, okay? So everybody wants this. There's a stalemate policy for the U.S. to achieve its goals. 1967, 1967 war demonstrates that Israel is a great U.S. asset on its own, was able to defeat multiple Arab armies. Okay? So now it becomes a Cold War asset in fulfilling the U.S.'s interest. Lyndon B. Johnson basically establishes in 1967 Israel's qualitative military edge, a policy of ensuring that Israel can defeat all of the Arab countries individually or collectively at any given point through massive transfers of military aid. That consciousness around Israel's role in the U.S.'s Cold War has been internalized by generations. Try talking about socialism, y'all. It's not easy.
Right.
And there is no AIPAC doing that work. There are things that are culturally inculcated, that are reproduced. Now, political scientists, why did I mention that? When the Iron Curtain falls, it kind of diminishes this argument. Well, now if there's no Soviet Union, then what is the value of Israel anymore to the United States? And that's where an AIPAC and the differential that it has. And what Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer show is that in most cases, the U.S. is fulfilling its own national interests in the Middle East that happen to overlap with Israel's interests. It is empire. Okay, it's not evil because Israel's giving it directions. It is an empire. It wants to secure those resources. It wants to be a hegemon. It is concerned that it be on the winning side of the most powerful Middle Eastern hegemon. It has taken a side of Saudi Arabia against Iran for that reason. Okay? That alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel is not AIPAC produced. When there is divergence between U.S. and Israeli interests, as there has been, for example, on Iranian rapprochement, nuclear rapprochement, that differential is what we can explain as being attributed to the lobby and the way that it works. Okay, so all I'm saying is, I don't want us, I think it's defeatist to think that AIPAC is that powerful. I think it's defeatist. We should limit, we should understand, there's a way of saying it in Arabic that says, "B'ta'ti kul shi wazno." You want to give everything its proper weight. And the problem is the U.S. And this is what Noam Chomsky has said for years also, and why he has a little bit of anxiety around BDS, because he thinks that the source of the problem is the United States and U.S. policy. Okay? The fact that we still celebrate Thanksgiving and Columbus Day, that we are charging Amy Goodman and Native organizers who oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline is emblematic of the fact that we are a settler colonial society participating in colonial aphasia and erasure. So this idea, that we're somehow just hating on Palestinians because we really want to hate them, or just supporting Israel because we're so afraid of AIPAC, is to forgive ourselves. We are a settler colony. We're a settler colony. Or to think about the way that we forgive ourselves of our state violence in the United States. And who do we target? Ferguson was occupied. It was a military occupation. There were tanks, there was tear gas, there was this is as much about us as it is about Israel. And so I'm not saying that AIPAC is not one of the most influential lobbies, special interest groups. It absolutely is. But if you want to put all your eggs in that basket, we're shooting at the wrong target. We got work to do here. And that's part of the work. And they're not that powerful. It also has to do with us. We're that unhealed. We're that broken. And that's why there's an alliance. And notice, that's why there's Canada, Australia, the United States. What do they all have in common? White people. That's right. And they're always on the same page around Israel. That's not a mistake. Okay, next question. Limits of the human rights paradigm. Not a lot of people are thinking about it because part of the Palestinian struggle has been to reinsert human rights into the paradigm and to move away from a politics paradigm. The critique of the human rights paradigm has come from those who are really disaffected by the BDS movement, and by the overinflation of the language of law, which is supplanted the language of politics. And so you have a number of frustrated people, rightly so, but they're targeting BDS as the source of the problem, rather than targeting the fact that we do not have a political program, and that is our responsibility. We have not resuscitated any kind of national leadership in the form of the PNC or the form of the PLO. And the only game in town becomes BDS and the BNC unelected leaders. And so they become the target of a lot of this antagonism, right? So where does it we begin to build an alternative political movement? That's the work that, frankly, we have not even invested enough time in that. There are initiatives. USPCN was an initiative to do that. The Palestinian Youth Movement is an initiative to do that. There are other smaller initiatives that seek to do that, but nothing that's become fully robust. And if you want more critique of this paradigm, I'll point you to a bunch of academic literature. It's mostly in the academic literature and less in the popular discourse, okay? Hamas. It's so funny. I mean, look, I'm going to answer Andrew. You have to be patient, okay? I'm going to answer your question. But as a teacher, I want this to be a learning moment as well. So I'm going to answer your question literally for what you're looking for, but I also want to answer the question rhetorically for what it's suggested, okay?
I'm a teacher, I understand.
Okay, so I want you to be patient, and I'm not ridiculing you, and I'm not devaluing your contribution, okay? So, Hamas. Hamas has come to symbolize its own discourse. You can say Hamas, and it says so much, you need not say anything else. So that you can, for example, go onto television, say Hamas 3 times, and somehow be perceived as making an argument. Okay? It has become an entire discourse that has been constructed, which is very deliberate. The construction of Hamas as a boogeyman, as the source of Israeli violence, as the source of Israeli anxiety, right? And that belies a lot of history. A lot of history. So I just want to walk us through some of those historical things. I'm going to end with the charter that you mentioned, okay? So the history that belies is that Hamas was not established until 1987. Okay? But Israel comes into existence in 1948. And Israel occupies the Gaza Strip for the first time in 1956. And then it occupies the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Sinai, and the Golan Heights in 1967. And it's participating in a number of massacres of Palestinians. And it exiles 80% of the Palestinian population from their original homes. And it creates a law of return for Jews only before there was Hamas. Before there was Hamas. And when Hamas establishes itself in the context of the Intifada, the first Intifada, they capture 2 Israeli soldiers. So now they're engaged in guerrilla warfare, which under the 1977 UN protocols is legal. Okay? Between 1974 and 1977, all of these national armed groups from the Congo and the Mozambique and Angola and the SWAPO and the ANC and so on and so forth are engaged in guerrilla warfare, and they bring it within the ambit of legal regulation through the 2 additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions, 1 and 2 in 1977, which recognizes this as warfare, not as terrorism. The US and Israel never recognize it, okay? Never recognize it. So what Hamas is doing, I'm not a lawyer for Hamas. If I were in Gaza, I would be protesting Hamas. Okay? This is not, it's good, it's bad and good, it's just bad for me, but I have so much to protest. It's not good for anybody. Okay? But let's take them on their own terms. And what they have done, when they capture those soldiers, is engage in war that's been recognized as legitimate. And they do not participate in illegitimate warfare, which is criminal and terroristic, until 1994, in the aftermath of the Ibrahimi massacre. They do not launch the first rocket until April 2001, until the aftermath of the several assassinations of Hamas political leaders. through extrajudicial assassinations, also known now, neutered to be known as targeted killings, right? So Hamas is constantly in this responsive posture. They're not established until 1987, but Israel has been participating in this eliminatory violence since 1948, since December 1947, I should say. Okay? So that's one. Why then are we overemphasizing that Hamas is the source of the problem? So I want you to participate with me in a little thought activity. If Hamas disappeared, would Israel end the siege on Gaza?
No.
How many believe that it would?
That's not the point.
No. We agreed that I get to finish and teach. Because it is the point. When you think about how Hamas is framed as, it is the way that the Supreme Court described the protesters in Gaza, okay? The way that they say that none of these protesters are civilians is they literally describe national protest as Hamas's new terrorist weapon. It is the point. Hamas is the straw man that Israel has used. It is why liberals will say, okay, we understand why Palestinians deserve a state in the West Bank, but we can't let them go in Gaza. It's the same logic that believes that prisons are necessary to keep criminals off our streets without asking, why are they being punished in the first place?
Right.
We are collectively, right now, we are collectively punishing Palestinians with a brutal siege over 11 years when we have been told repeatedly, this is not just a humanitarian crisis, it is a catastrophe. The Gaza Strip will be unlivable. There's no water, there's no hygiene, there's no food. They are kept just above subsistence. It is the point. The only reason we've accepted this is because we believe that if there anything other than that would mean that Hamas would destroy and massacre all Jews. That is the logic that has been embedded of why we create. It's why if you did an interview in 2002 and you did an interview in 2018, it's the same questions about Hamas. It's why when Israel kills 3 young Palestinian boys in July, the first question a news broadcaster wants to ask me is, do you think this, how much responsibility does Hamas bear? This is a form of victim blaming. Analytically, it is the point. We want to blame the victim. Now, does that mean that Hamas is without critique? Absolutely not.
Yeah, tell us.
Absolutely not. I mean, I can also recommend books for you. I recommend a lot of documentaries. If it's just thirst for understanding how bad Hamas is, if that's what this is driving. But the way that you framed the question was almost as if something about Hamas makes us better understand Israel's behavior. And I'm trying...
That's not my point.
That's not your point?
No. Yeah,
Okay.
You have correctly stated Hamas oppresses the Palestinian people in an interview. I heard it online. It was you. And you just now said if you were in Gaza, you'd be protesting Hamas. Wonderful. Tell us why. Obviously, it holds
So you just want to know what stuff's
Obviously, it
about
holds some
Hamas?
importance to you. What I'm saying is there is no peace process until the Palestinian people stop supporting Hamas. That's my
Excuse me. You had your question, sir. If she's trying to answer, we need to get to other questions as well.
You realize that this is also instructive because we've understood that Hamas is not, that the critique of Hamas is not because it explains Israel's behavior, but somehow there is no peace process until Palestinians no longer support Hamas. That's a circular argument because it's conditioning Palestinian freedom on Hamas's existence. And so everything that I said did answer that question because Hamas is not the problem. If they went away, we still have an Israel problem. Israel doesn't have a Hamas problem, it has a Palestine problem. Now, I also said that the Palestinian Authority was the Palestinian problem, even more so than Hamas. You know why? Because they have signed away my rights. Because they have colluded with the Israeli government in the massacre of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Because they are part of building the fabric of life road. Because they have led us to this path where Jerusalem is no longer even considered the Palestinian capital. Why would I protest against Hamas before I protest against the Palestinian
I don't know, you just said you would.
I'm just saying, nobody else asked me, nobody else ever said, stop supporting the Palestinian Authority before you can have peace. But everybody asked me about Hamas. Everybody asked me about Hamas. So I do think that my answer was answering your question. And then you brought up the charter, which isn't about Palestinians. Again, it's about Israel. Again, it's about Israel.
All right, guys, we're going to do some last comments / questions.
Hi, this is Abbas. Welcome, everyone. I just want to welcome Nura here again, once again. Noura Erakat was also a member of an AUDA way back in New York, the New Jersey Committee. So she's been a long-time comrade for about 20 years. So I just want to re-welcome here. And the gentleman left, I just wanted him to hear, to say that I'm Palestinian and I'm not Hamas, and there will never be a resolution. Okay, I get it, he left. But we all have our own thoughts, and
Let her finish some question now.
she is. I'm just commenting, that's all.
Go ahead.
That's not relax. I wanted to change the mood, that was the whole point, but he left, that's great. Okay? But as a Palestinian, most of us believe, the refugees, that there will never be peace or any negotiations without the right of return. It has nothing to do with Hamas. That was the whole point. I was trying to change the mood, but he left. Very good.
No, not very good. I mean, I think what he's asking is it's actually more dangerous than most people who are dishonest. That there can be no peace if there's Hamas. He wants to frame it even more dangerously than that, which is that Palestinians aren't suited to govern themselves until they can recognize what hurts them the most. And Hamas is the most pressing threat to Palestinians. That's what he was telling me.
True.
Right? And so that's actually even more dangerous.
He's known. There are people here in Cleveland that we know who they are, and as soon as he stood up or was there, we knew what it was about. So don't worry about it, Nura.
Right to exist. So I want to ask, does Israel recognize Palestine's right to exist? And the second one is, you mentioned 2 women in the U.S. politics, and you didn't mention Alexandria, and I wondered if you wanted to say something about Alexandria also. Thank you.
Okay. That's going to be the last question. If you have any additional questions, since we're out of time, I'm sure that Nura would be welcome to questions later. I'm not trying to speak for you, but maybe. I don't know.
Sure.
Okay, so we're good. We're good. Perfect. Thank you.
Actually, so the first question hits on also what Andrew was asking about in terms of the charter. There is this overemphasis that Hamas wants to destroy Israel. It says so in its charter. It wants the law. I get it, okay? But the overemphasis on the charter almost makes it sound like that writing is more significant than the fact that Israel in practice is doing exactly what they're afraid and accusing Hamas preemptively of doing. Israel has never recognized Palestine. They recognized the PLO, and only because last minute, it's a long story, but it never wanted to recognize the PLO, and it has never recognized Palestine, and does not recognize that there will be a Palestinian state. And yet it's Palestinians who have recognized Israel multiple times over, beginning in 1987, and then again by signing the peace agreement in 1993, and endorsing Resolution 242, who have always recognized Israel. Okay? So the fact that we're overemphasizing what Hamas says rather than what Israel does is part of the fact of what is at stake here. And why are we setting up Hamas as the straw man in order not to deal with the real issue, which is a settler colonial structure of the nation and an apartheid reality. I didn't mention Alexandria because Alexandria doesn't have very good politics on Palestine.
Thank you.
She hasn't endorsed BDS, and I think her heart's in the right place, and I think that she's still developing and hasn't come out firmly, knowing that she is in Bernie's camp. I think she at least believes in the very basics, but has not gone as far as endorsing BDS.
I thought she had spoken toward Palestine so far.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you all so much.